In the stillness of a Korean night, a distant bugle sounded, a chilling note that every American and United Nations soldier came to dread. It heralded not just any assault, but the impending human wave attack. From their position, UNC troops watched as the horizon itself seemed to shift, with thousands of Chinese soldiers advancing, many armed only with grenades and raw determination. Tales had circulated among the UNC ranks of these adversaries, so fearless they'd charge into the very jaws of death. Witnessing it, however, was an entirely different ordeal. This audacious tactic didn't emerge in isolation. Early in the war, the Chinese plotted their counter as American and UNC forces confidently pressed into North Korean territory. Utilizing the terrain and the element of surprise, they executed a series of ambushes that sent the UNC reeling. Recognizing the need for a strategic pivot, by early 1951, the UNC fortified its positions, stretching defensively from east to west. The Chinese, ever adaptive, responded with their now infamous human wave, a tactic as much about psychological warfare as it was about numbers. While historians might debate the terminology, those who faced this onslaught had no doubts. Veterans recounted the overwhelming force of the assault, comparing it to a tidal wave or a stadium's crowd spilling onto the battlefield. One poignant reflection captured the scene's eerie intensity, quote, "Suddenly, the whole hillside stood up." Like a moth to a flame. Amid the turmoil of the Korean War, a pivotal moment arose when United Nations command troops crossed the 38th parallel, prompting a plea from Kim Il-sung to Chairman Mao Zedong for direct military aid. In turn, Mao, willing to intervene, sought assurances from Joseph Stalin of Soviet air power. Stalin agreed to extend air defenses to protect vital areas and promise new weapons and armaments factories for China. General Peng Dehuai, a seasoned veteran, was tasked with leading the Chinese People's Volunteers Force, or CPVF, into Korea. The Chinese First Offensive had a limited goal of testing the U.S. Republic of Korea's fighting capabilities and slowing their advance. In the Battle of Wonjong-Unsan, the Chinese inflicted significant losses on 7 Korean and U.S. regiments, disrupting supply routes and adopting effective combat tactics. The appearance of Soviet-flown MiG-15 jet fighters over North Korea raised concern for the UNC, leading to an intense battle for air superiority. The U.S. deployed F-86 Sabre jet interceptors to counter the threat and protect the 8th Army from enemy air attacks. However, the B-29's flying raids into MiG Alley faced significant challenges from the formidable defense of the bridges and dams on the Yalu River. The Far East Air Forces, or FEAF, launched a devastating air assault on North Korea, targeting structures that could shield the Chinese from the harsh winter. Despite the destruction, the Chinese prepared for their second offensive to lure the Americans and their allies into a trap. And in General MacArthur's alleged only mistake of the war, the coalition troops moved northward into the enemy's hands. The darkest hour. Peng deployed a massive Chinese and North Korean force of almost 500,000 soldiers surrounding the forward elements of the American and South Korean units. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese troops pushed them back to South Korea. In the east, Peng's 13th Army Group attacked, almost cutting off the 1st Corps. The 1st Corps managed to fight their way through ambushes and return to Pyongyang. Simultaneously, the Chinese 9th Army Group attacked the 1st Marine Division near the Changjin Reservoir. The Marines bravely fought their way south, defeating 7 Chinese divisions, and found refuge at the port of Hungnam. During a crisis meeting, MacArthur and General Walton Walker agreed to establish enclaves in North Korea, hoping to hold the Pyongyang-Wonsan line. However, Walker, unhappy with MacArthur's actions, took matters into his own hands and started his troops moving southward, destroying what they couldn't carry. With the UNC forces pushed out of North Korea, Mao Zedong expanded his war objectives to unify all of Korea and drive the Americans and their allies off the peninsula. On January 4th, 1951, the sky north of the Han River was filled with the deafening noise of airstrikes, while American and British engineers worked tirelessly on the southern bank of the river. The situation was dire. One final locomotive, carrying desperate refugees, made its way across the rail bridge. The engineers knew they had to act fast. With tension in the air, orders were given and buttons were pressed. The bridge's central span collapsed in a massive cloud of smoke and dust, crashing onto the frozen river below. Despite their efforts, the US-led UNC forces suffered a defeat. Communist troops were once again entering Seoul for the second time in 7 months. The winter of 1950 and 51 became the darkest hour for the Free World forces in Korea. Wildcard. In the theater of warfare, a human wave attack emerges as a bold and audacious strategy. This offensive maneuver hinges on the notion of an unguarded, head-on assault by a tightly packed battalion of infantry aimed at overpowering the enemy's defenses in a tumultuous clash. The very name evokes imagery of a colossal tide of soldiers crashing upon the opposition with unyielding might. The essence of a human wave attack, as meticulously defined by U.S. Army analyst Edward C. O'Dowd, lies in its stark simplicity. It entails the coordinated rush of infantry formations, densely concentrated, surging forth to challenge the adversary's line. Unlike more subtle tactics that seek to conceal movement, this approach deliberately forsakes subterfuge. Its purpose is singular: to flood the battlefield with an overwhelming mass of combatants, plunging headlong into ferocious melee combat. The objective is to evoke chaos and disarray in the enemy ranks, aiming to shatter their resolve or force them to yield ground. Such a daring strategy hinges upon raw courage, coercion, or a fervent sense of purpose for the attackers to advance resolutely into enemy fire. Yet, when pitted against the mechanized might of modern warfare, complete with automatic firearms, artillery barrages, and aerial bombardments, the human wave tactic stands on precarious ground. The tactical advantage of concealment and cover is willingly forfeited in exchange for the potency of numbers and the velocity of assault. This stratagem resonates with those who lack advanced training or sophisticated weaponry, but can rally and lead their forces. In an arena where maneuverability and firepower may be scarce, a human wave attack becomes a desperate but forceful recourse. It is a gamble, a high-stakes wager, where the odds favor those who can marshal a relentless surge. Chase away the nightmare. Peng's third offensive lasted for 6 long months and included some of the biggest and most intense battles of the entire war. The sheer number of Chinese soldiers was astonishing and terrifying, and there was no denying the reality of their tactics. While the UNC troops relied on firepower to try and crush the Chinese forces, the Chinese took a different approach. They attacked from up close, in massive numbers, and often under cover of darkness, making those battles particularly nightmarish. Peng's third offensive was a powerful and forceful attack that broke through the Republic of Korea, or ROK's, best defense, the 1st Division at the Imjin River. The ROK commander, General Paik Sun-yup, couldn't believe the devastating defeat and described it as an unbearable shock and a terrible nightmare. Meanwhile, as the war raged on, the UNC soldiers in Guiyang faced a close call. They narrowly managed to escape complete destruction as the city of Seoul was abandoned and the enemy approached their rear guard. Then the Chinese, now supported by a resurgent North Korean army, launched their 4th offensive in February 1951, aiming to drive the UNC into the ocean. The South Korean divisions were initially caught off guard by attacks, causing the UNC to retreat. Still, Peng was in a tough spot. With his supply line stretched thin and facing strong UNC opposition, his move was less than successful. Historically, UNC units had retreated before attacking Chinese forces, but at Jipyong-ni on February 13th, the 23rd U.S. Regimental Combat Team and the French Battalion held their ground instead of retreating. When the Chinese launched an attack with bugle calls, the French responded with a siren and counterattacked using bayonets. They managed to repel the Chinese assault, and a relief column broke through on the 15th, boosting UNC morale. A month later, the rejuvenated 1st ROK Division recaptured the ruined Seoul, marking a significant moment because it was the first time the UNC successfully countered a Chinese offensive. They cautiously moved north, while Peng withdrew past the 38th parallel to regroup and plan for the war's largest offensive. The Falling Knife. The 5th offensive began on April 22nd with 305,000 soldiers, which was more than the Germans had when they took over Stalingrad in 1942, and twice the number of Allied troops during the D-Day landing in 1944. Their goal was to break through the United Nations defense line, surround and defeat key units, and retake Seoul by May 1st. However, the initial shock of the offensive was halted in 2 crucial battles. At Gapyeong, the South Korean 6th Division was overwhelmed, and the 28th Commonwealth Brigade stepped in to fill the gap. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, Australian and Canadian troops fought fiercely to slow the enemy's advance. On the Imjin River, the British 29th Brigade faced overwhelming odds of 7-1 for 3 nights. By the 25th, the Gloucester Battalion of the brigade found itself surrounded on Hill 235, deep in enemy territory. U.S. forces meant to rescue them were redirected to deal with their own problems. In a heartbreaking turn of events, the Gloucesters exhausted all their ammunition before attempting a breakout. Only 63 out of 650 soldiers managed to escape. Their courageous stand, however, captured the world's attention. The battles at Gapyong and Imjin River gave the UNC time to retreat in stages, inflicting damage on the enemy along the way. By the end of the month, the Chinese offensive lost momentum, stopping 5 miles north of Seoul. The Chinese forces faded into the background once again. Cutthroat negotiation. Despite being battered, Chinese Commander Peng launched the 6th Offensive from May 16th to 23rd. This time, the previously unreliable South Korean 6th Division proved its mettle, holding its ground against overwhelming odds near Mount Yongmun and encircling major Chinese units. The Korean War had reached a critical stage. The Chinese and North Korean forces, despite heavy casualties, had grown to 1.2 million soldiers. The United Nations Command had also suffered losses, but had substantial ground troops, including 256,000 U.S. soldiers, 500,000 from ROKA, and 28,000 from other allied countries. Still, both sides were horrified by the heavy toll and decided to pull back. Both sides realized that achieving peace through military victory was becoming increasingly costly. The US and UN were no longer aiming for anything beyond returning to the pre-war status quo and were open to negotiations. Thereafter, the U.S. National Security Council adopted a policy to support a unified, democratic Korea, even if achieved through non-military means and without overthrowing Kim Il-sung. General Ridgway was authorized to participate in talks for an armistice, and on June 30th, he announced his readiness for discussions. The Chinese and North Koreans agreed to discuss arrangements for a meeting, choosing the city of Kaesong as the location. The mobile phase of the Korean War ended. It had transformed from a civil conflict in an unfamiliar Asian region into a police action by the United Nations and later turned into the Cold War's first major conflict. While combat continued in the ruined landscapes for 2 more years, both sides focused on making limited gains as they negotiated. The goal was no longer complete victory, but rather positioning for short-term advantages, marking an era of limited war, where both sides would use talks and fighting for advantage to eventually end the conflict. Thank you for tuning in to our video. If you enjoyed what you saw, give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button on our Dark Docs channel. Delve deeper into modern warfare tactics by exploring our collection. And remember, there's more riveting content waiting for you on our other Dark Documentaries channels. Don't miss out.